So, when you hear the progressive era, what pops in your head? Probably trust busting, right? Economic regulation, the rise of the modern state? Yeah, that's the story we all get in school. But what if that's only half the picture? Today, we're going to dig into a source that tells a totally different story, one about a deep, bitter cultural conflict that literally reshaped the American family itself. We're taught that this period, from around the 1880s to the 1920s, was all about government trying to catch up with a new industrial economy. But was there something else going on? A different kind of battle? A much more personal one, being fought for the very heart and soul of the country.
And here it is, the core argument from the source we're looking at. It claims this era wasn't just about economics. No, it was a full-blown culture war, a fierce ethno-religious conflict between two competing groups, fighting to define what an American family should be, and they were ready to use the power of the state to make sure their definition won.
Okay, so to really get what was going on in this culture war, you gotta meet the two sides. On one side, you have the pietists, and on the other, the liturgicals. And these weren't just, political affiliations. These were deep cultural identities that pretty much drove everything.
All right, first up, the Pietists. Think Northern Evangelical Protestants, folks of British or Scandinavian descent mostly. And here's the absolute key to understanding them. They believed that salvation wasn't just a private matter. For them to be saved, they felt they had to create a holy society for everyone. And how do you do that? By using the government to stamp out sin. We're talking alcohol, gambling, not respecting the Sabbath, you name it.
And then you've got the other team, the liturgicals. This was a whole different world. These were mainly Catholics and high church Lutherans, a lot of them German and Irish immigrants. For them, salvation came through the church, through its rituals. They were way more relaxed about personal sin. A beer on a Sunday wasn't a one-way ticket to damnation. And they thought the state's job was to pave roads, not save souls.
So you can see how this sets up a massive clash, right? Let's put it side by side. For the Pietists, salvation meant cleaning up society and the state was their tool. They voted Republican. For the liturgicals, salvation was a church matter, the state needed to stay out of it, and they voted Democrat. I mean, these two worldviews were on an absolute collision course. So you've got these two opposing forces. Where do they fight it out? Well, the first major battleground was the public school system. This was where the next generation of Americans was going to be molded. And believe me, both sides knew it. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to this quote from a major progressive sociologist at the time. "Little plastic lumps of human dough." Wow. I mean, this tells you everything. It wasn't about reading, writing, and arithmetic. The goal was to take kids from their immigrant homes and reshape them, overriding their family's values to create one uniform American culture. And this wasn't just some abstract theory. It was a real fight. Take San Francisco. It was a decades-long tug-of-war for the schools. You can see it right here. Every time the Irish Catholic Democrats would win local elections and get some control, the Protestant elite would just change the rules of the game to take it back. And the final move? In 1920, they just cut the voters out completely and gave control to appointed bureaucrats. Game over. And this quote, this really gets to the heart of the matter. For these reformers, when a child grew up, they didn't belong to their parents, they belonged to the state. Think about that. This wasn't just an educational philosophy, it was a direct assault on the very idea of the liturgical family, and it shows you just how high the stakes really were. Okay, so the fight started in the schools, but it definitely didn't end there. The next battleground was the ballot box itself. See, as more and more Catholic immigrants arrived and had bigger families, the pietists could see the writing on the wall. Demographically, they were losing. They needed a game changer, and fast. And that game changer, according to this source, was women's suffrage. The thinking was pretty straightforward. They figured that native Protestant women would vote in much higher numbers than Catholic immigrant women. So by giving all women the vote, they could create a brand new electoral majority to push their causes. It was a numbers game. And the support for suffrage came overwhelmingly from pietist groups, especially organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. For them, getting women the vote was the key to their ultimate prize, a nationwide ban on alcohol, which, let's be real, was a direct attack on the culture of the Irish and German immigrants. The source points out some pretty uncomfortable truths here, highlighting this quote from Susan B. Anthony. When she's talking about the people voting against suffrage in Colorado, she reportedly complained about Mexican greasers and other foreign-born citizens.
A quote like that really lays bare how tied up the push for the vote was with a fear of immigrants. So, from the schools and the ballot box, the conflict moved into the most personal space imaginable, the family itself. The very question of who should be having kids and how many suddenly became a political issue.
And this is where we get into something pretty dark, the eugenics movement, which was seen as a very scientific part of progressive thinking. The logic was chillingly simple. You manage the population. You discourage the people you call unfit from having kids. And who got labeled unfit? Well, what a coincidence, it was often those same Catholic and Jewish immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Now, the source we're looking at argues that this eugenics impulse was directly tied to the early birth control movement. The problem for the pietists wasn't just immigration. It was that the Catholic families already here were having more kids. So the goal was to push birth control as a tool to, well, to solve this demographic problem.
And you don't have to read between the lines. This quote from birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger makes the connection crystal clear. She said their goal was to stop the multiplication of the unfit as a step toward race betterment. It's right there, in her own words.
So you've got all these different threads, the fight to control schools, to control voting, to control the family. And in 1912, it all comes to a head. The Progressive Party convention that year wasn't just some political get-together. It was the grand finale of this 50-year cultural crusade.
Just listen to how a reporter from the New York Times described it. He said it was like a Methodist camp meeting done over into political terms. Teddy Roosevelt literally called his acceptance speech a confession of faith. The delegates were singing Onward Christian Soldiers. This was it. This was the complete fusion of that pietist religious passion with raw state power.
So what's the big takeaway here? This source completely reframes the progressive era. It says it wasn't just about economics. It was a crusade by one cultural group to use the government to control another. The battlefields were our most important institutions, our schools, our right to vote, and our families. And this cultural mission, the source argues, went hand in glove with the economic push for a bigger, more powerful regulatory state.
And that leaves us with a really big question. If you start to see the expansion of government power, not just as an economic story, but as the result of a culture war to control the family, well, how does that change the way we think about the debates we're still having today, about the government's role in our most personal lives? It's definitely something to think about.